Welcome everyone and good morning, perhaps afternoon, maybe even good evening to you. Today is Saturday. We are in the middle, I guess, of the weekend, and yesterday we looked at the raid. Yesterday we had our, I guess, weekly update of how things were going in the raid. So now it is only logical that we go over into the next of the PvE activities, being of course Mythic Plus. So it is going to be a quite interesting and variable week, because this is the week where characters get their double legendary. Yes, I'm sorry, condolences if you still don't have your 4-piece set bonus. So perhaps not everyone has unlocked their full power, but a big chunk of your borrowed power just came this week with the second legendary. So this is the week where we are starting to get more logs, we are starting to get more players into the raid, and then also into Mythic Plus with double legendary. It is quite visible, for example, by the speed with which high groups, high keys have been cleared. You know, we went from clearing plus 22s, plus 23 keys into clearing plus 27 keys in a matter of a handful of days of this week, just because of the power of the second legendary. You know, it's a period where plenty of people are pointing out how crazy strong certain combos are, right? You have people reporting on guardian druids, Ventir guardian druids with their cooldowns and double legendary doing tons of damage. You have of course Prot Paladin as well as a tank. You have plenty of other DPS specs finding some massively increased damage when it comes to AoE particularly. So quite a few things are bound to change from last week. Of course, this is just Saturday, so we're going to be able to see even more change by next week when we check this again. So perhaps the best we can see now is the trend, the initial starting trend of the specs that are now clearing Mythic Plus keys with 2 legendaries. So we're starting of course with the popularity and how often are you going to see these specs in the keys. And we are going, of course, once again for the higher level of keys, mostly because the all keys numbers, the keys from 10 to 15 to 5 even, have remained mostly the same. As I said last week, by this point we have hundreds of thousands. We are approaching the 1 million entries for specs, so it is going to be very difficult week by week to see any significant change in those low entry, I guess, keys. So once we look at the higher keys, you know, the ones where the meta starts meaning something, the ones where you as a poor shadow priest might start seeing yourself being declined, or you as a discipline priest might start seeing yourself being declined, that level of keys. So compared to last week, without the availability of the double legendary power increase, we're starting with tanks, because tanks are the slot in which we have gotten less change overall. Once again, we do have the pretty much unchanged situation of protection warriors, which are still, as I said last week, just pretend Prot Warrior isn't in the picture. And once you pretend Prot Warrior isn't in the picture, the balance of the other tank specs is quite nice to see, right? These are pretty high key levels, plus 20, and yet every single one of the other tank specs is at 10% or more. In fact, the lowest one is Vengeance, which is at 13.8%, which is very, very healthy for a tank. Of course, even though it's a healthy balance, we do still see Prot Paladin being the standout pick for tanks now that they have 2-piece and their damage is going to skyrocket. Perhaps they are going to rise even more. Who knows? We will see later on. But for the moment, this is how tanks have been, I guess, behaving week by week. It's interesting. They are the more unchanged of the roles, even with the arrival of the double legendary, at the very least so far in this first, I guess, half of the first week of the second legendary being available. So this is the situation for the tanks at the moment when it comes to the popularity. What about healers now? Now, looking at the healers, we have already looked at the situation when it comes to the raid. We have had a lengthy talk about why Holy Priest was rising in the raid. But here's the thing, that the very powerful HPS throughput and the very powerful cooldown that Holy Priest brings in the raid doesn't really have much to do with Mythic Plus, right? You don't really pick healers in Mythic Plus because of their high throughput or because of their super strong defensive cooldowns. You want damage. You want damage in Mythic Plus as a healer. So what do we see? after a week, and with these specs being able to have a second legendary. What do we see? So the trend, we can say, is the same. The trend is still that, of course, Restoration Shaman is the dominating healer. However, between this week and last week, we do see that Resto Shaman has lost 6% of representation in high keys, and Holy Priest gained 3%. So technically, it's a 9% swing. Technically, last week, Holy Priest was 26% participation away from Resto Shaman, while this week, they are only 17% away. So they're getting closer. It's still a long way out, but they are getting closer. Now, where are the other changes? For healers, the other change is not that relevant. You do have an even slightly, but it's still there, less representation of Holy Paladins and more representation of Resto Druids. To the point that, as we pointed out last week, Holy Paladin was at the risk of even losing top 3 position from Resto Druid. This week, it has happened. This week is Resto Druid, who has now taken the 3rd place as a healer in Mythic Plus over Holy Paladin. Now, there are some very min-maxing thing we might mention, like the fact that at the very highest of keys, so even above the plus 20 level, survivability and being able to stay alive and soak some very massive hits that you can get at that level of keys has for the moment still made Holy Paladin quite wanted. When we look at the top groups basically running for Mythic Plus highest keys, Holy Paladin is still one of the more represented healers, unlike what we see in this level of keys. But beyond that handful of groups, beyond those 5 or 6 groups clearing keys that high for the moment, Holy Paladin is losing representation, while the other 2, I guess, HPS specs, Holy Priest and Restoration Druid, are gaining. What about Mistweaver? Well, you know, technically they have gained some representation. Technically they went from 3.3 to 4.1. So we're talking about a solid 20, almost 30% increase, right? Cool. It's still not much for the moment. They're still not really being represented too much. It's unlikely that it's going to swing much higher with the second legendary either. So this seems to be the place that Mistweaver will have for this tier at the moment. Now we can start diving into the DPS. So the DPS are going to have a few more swings worth mentioning, starting with the melee DPS as usual. So first of all, we have to point out that week in, week out, the position of Fury Warrior is still the same. If I wasn't as lazy, I might even say that this is probably the highest Fury Warrior has been when it comes to Mythic Plus representation. If we go back in previous expansions, I'm sure you will remember Outlaw Rogue and Havoc Demon Hunter being generally the monopolizers of Mythic Plus representation for melee. I don't really remember Fury Warrior being this high previously, so I'm pretty sure this is the new personal record for Fury Warrior in terms of representation. It might also be the personal record of worst representation for arms as a result, of course. 1.6% this week. It's very, very low. So that's unfortunate for them. At least you have the backup option of going Fury. Look at the poor Red Paladin instead. Okay, you are in no position to complain if you're an arms warrior, given that at the very least you have a backup plan as opposed to other specs like Feral or Retribution, for example. So at the very least you have that. Then we also have an interesting change, which is Subtlety. Subtlety has dropped a significant amount, more than 20% of the representation from last week to this week. It's interesting because it's not that the other rogue specs have gained it, right? We talked about this before. Usually, if Fury Warrior, for example, gains popularity, it's because Arms is going to play Fury. Meanwhile, in this case, we do have Subtlety losing representation, but no other rogue spec is actually gaining it. So the only, of course, logical assumption is that there are more players from other specs into the pool of high keys, making the rogue number shrink. So the question would be, where are these other players? What is making the rogue pool of player base shrink? Well, number one is survival. The power of AoE survival is very high at the moment, so they went from 5.3% last week to 9.3% last week. They almost doubled the representation over a week. So perhaps that's where the rogue players went. Another slight increase is not as big as the survival, but enhancement as well. Enhancement went from 7% to 9.2. This is a 30% increase in representation from 1 week to the next. Enhancement is also gaining a decent amount of power with their double legendary. It is more powerful in red encounters. That's where you will want your Night Fae combo for enhancement. So for Mythic Plus, they are more likely to go other covenants that don't give them enough power, basically, compared to the raid combo, but still, they are rising nonetheless. The other specs don't change too drastically. We do have another shrinking, not as big as the shrinking of Subtlety, but Windwalker is also losing a tiny bit of representation. Meanwhile, Havoc is more or less the same. So we do see, hold on, we do see some growth here and there, enhancement and survival in particular, followed up by the losing a little bit of representation of Subtlety Rogues and Windwalker Monks when it comes to melee DPS. On the other hand, when it comes to ranged DPS don't have as much of an exciting level of growth from some niche hipster specs that the melee DPS had, unfortunately. We do still see as the standout pick for Mythic Plus Marksmanship Hunter over Beast Mastery due to their natural, stronger burst, which is much valuable in Mythic Plus. And also, I would say that the Relic is quite handy for marksmanship, because the getting more of your CD back off cooldown is quite more powerful for marksmanship. As we said, the most powerful cooldown for Beast Mastery is Bestial Wrath, except Bestial Wrath is already damn near available all the time. So it's not that is going to massively empower your cooldowns, okay? So it's also that problem, I guess, for Beast Mastery. No growth whatsoever for Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest is still just lingering at the bottom and is lingering in there together with Elemental. If we want to be precise, Elemental gained about 20% more representation. It still leaves them towards the bottom, but they are growing at the very least. This, if you want to be honest, is perhaps the largest drop in popularity compared to last year. Right? Elemental was growing as a Mythic Plus spec, tons of AoE. Supposedly, it should have been this tier as well, right? It should have had a similar amount of burst damage, the Echoes of Great Sundering being able to be paired together with a Covenant Legendary now. Instead, not really, for the moment. So, kind of disappointing, honestly. At the very least, Shaman had enhancement growing, so yeah, it's a little bit harder for an Elemental Shaman to just respec over to enhancement, as it is, for example, for a Fury Warrior and an Arms Warrior to swap around, but at the very least, it's not all doom and gloom for the DPS specs of Shaman. Also, the biggest of the changes for ranged this week. It was surprising, it was nice to see, right? Kind of even romantic in a way, to see Frost and Fire Mage holding hands together at 17.1% representation last week. Very, very high, in fact, of representation. This week, I think they broke up. I think they were in a fight and they broke up because Frost Mage has more or less remained where it was, while it was Fire that instead lost quite a bit of representation. What we see this week, on the other hand, is a significant rise of Warlocks entries in Mythic Plus. You know, Frost Mage has remained around where it was, but Fire Mage lost like 5% of the representation. Where did it all go? Perhaps all these mages instant respect to Warlock or something, or simply more Warlocks got into Mythic Plus, because from last week we do have a growth of Demonology, but also a significant growth of Destruction. In fact, Destruction almost doubled its representation over time, over a week in Mythic Plus, and Demonology grew as well. So the biggest growth for ranged this week went to Warlock. Not just for Demonology, but also for Destruction. Yeah, Affliction kind of lost out in this trade by quite a bit, but they were quite low already anyways, so it's not too big of a deal for them. This is, at the moment, the current situation when it comes to popularity for ranged specs. Now, to have a laugh about Mythic Plus, we can look at the performance being shown to us by logs of Mythic Plus keys. Obviously, when you look at the performance of Mythic Plus, is not as clear-cut as a raid. You know, if you look at a raid, the performance of a DPS is being shown by its DPS. That's very simple. The performance of a Mythic Plus player is much more fickle because it's about the key you have been doing, the time you have had in the key, the amount of players of your same spec that are popular. So it's not exactly the same as looking at the performance of a raid. But because I like bars, I like rankings and positions, I like to see this one as well. The performance. The performance compared to last week, now that we have in mind the double legendaries as well, we do have the biggest of the growths in line with the growth of the popularity of the spec. The biggest growth goes to survival. Survival went from middle of the pack-ish to being towards the top. I think now it's 7th right now, so it's pretty good. Fire Mage has remained there, despite the fact that Frost Mage broke up with them and is now more clear towards the top. Fire Mage is still the one that comes out more and better performing in keys. This is also, of course, thanks to the fact that at the highest of keys, it is Fire Mage that it is still preferred over Frost Mage. We do also see some other longer time members of the top of the rankings like Subtlety Rogue and Windwalker Monk when it comes to Mythic Plus keys. Marksmanship Hunter is also there as well, as usual. Demolock is also rising in the ranks a little bit more over last week. These are the most, I guess, clear-cut changes when it comes to the performance being shown in the logs of Mythic Plus keys. Personally, I will tell you my personal feelings I have about this list. I am kind of sad about Red Paladin. I think as an ex-Red Paladin player from a few years ago, I am kind of sad of the state of Red Paladin because, you know, they are towards the bottom in the raid. They are towards the bottom in Mythic Plus. I'm kind of sad because I like the way they play. I like their cooldown windows. I thought they would have been good. Every time I look at Red Paladin and I'm starting to count their cooldowns and look what they can do with them. As I said, perhaps with the Relic and the faster CDR in Mythic Plus, they might even do better because of their strong cooldowns, and yet every time they just seem to just linger, to just slip towards the bottom. It's kind of it's kind of unlucky, honestly. I like the spec. That's why I'm kind of sad seeing them that back down, honestly. When it comes to the performance of healers, this is of course much, I guess, less relevant, but still, we do see somewhat similar to their popularity. We see Restoration Shaman and Holy Priest at the top, and Mistweaver Monk at the bottom. So that's kind of more or less the representation as well. You have the middle of Holy Paladin, Disc Priest, and Resto Druid being a little bit closer to each other. The other more interesting change, I guess, is when it comes to the performance shown by tanks. Because we do see that Prot Paladin is towards the bottom. Of course, the absolute bottom, as you can see by the quite worse state of Protection Warrior, right? That's clear. But Prot Paladin, despite their more prevalent presence in keys, doesn't show up as much in the performance. Perhaps it's because there is more Prot Paladin, perhaps because it is Flavor of the Month. There are more bad Protection Paladins depleting more keys, which shows up as a worse result for Prot Paladin. Perhaps that's the reason why they're not as well performing as their popularity would suggest. Now, of course, given the week we are in, it would be logical to assume that many, if not most, of these changes are being brought to you by Double Legendary. So it is easy to speculate that, oh, this certain spec, like, say, Survival Hunter, has become almost twice as much as represented in Mythic Plus because they now got their hands on a Double Legendary. So perhaps this is likely the situation for most of these growth in popularity, and also the opposite, and also the shrinking, the decreasing of popularity of certain specs. Because, of course, if Enhancement Shaman becomes more popular because of the Double Legendary and Survival Hunter becomes more popular because of the Double Legendary, we are bound to see less of a presence of some of their specs. As a result, if more players are bringing Survival Hunters and Enhancement Shamans to their keys, they are bound to be declining some other melee specs, right? That's kind of logical. Obviously, we are still not even done with the first week, the first complete week of this Double Legendary power-up, so we have to wait, essentially. We have to wait a few more days once we get the full picture of all of these specs playing with 2 legendaries, more logs, and more entries of only results with 2 legendaries instead of just 1, as well as, of course, the ever-elusive 4-piece set bonus that many players still don't have. And unfortunately, yes, the creation catalyst and your choice of a crafted tier piece is still 2.5 weeks away, I'm afraid. Many people have been saying that this would have been the week where it would have been fitting to add the creation catalyst by the second week of Mythic or the start of the third week of Mythic, perhaps expecting the world first race to be over. It would have been a pretty nice timing to add the creation catalyst. Instead, we have to wait a few weeks more. Unfortunate, to be fair, particularly for me, since I am still missing my 4-piece set bonus. No, I'm not angry at all. But not being angry at all, I'm still gonna go and end this video. Completely unrelated to my anger. Of course, we're gonna be able to see more of this as time goes on. Same goes for the raid and what is being modified by these borrowed powers we are getting in these last few days of 9.2. As usual, thank you guys for watching the video and for helping support the channel in whichever way you can, like commenting down below or liking the video or even subscribing to the channel. But for today, my security team is unlocking the subscription button to every of the specs mentioned today that have grown in popularity in Mythic Plus in this last week. Thank you again. You can also follow me up on Twitter. I'm still wondering what would be the purpose, honestly, but I mean, if you want, you can. Just as much as a question mark for purpose, you can also support me on Patreon, which is going to give you also access to my Discord server. That being said, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, what's going on with Tazavesh, honestly? Why every time I get into Tazavesh, my loading screen takes 15 seconds? What's up with the dungeon?